guys, welcome beloveds to a new video. I hope you guys have been having an amazing day, and as you can see from the title, we have something a tad bit different today, but I am so excited. I cannot be more excited to have this video with you. So yes, as you see from the title, I finally discovered our roots as an African American back to Africa. This has been a long journey, and if you guys saw my previous mini docu-series where I was tracing it back, you would see that this has been going on for years. It has got to be, I think, well over 15 years that I started this genealogy journey, and knowing that I'm just that close to the end really had me so emotional. So really, why is this a big deal though? If you hear these statistics, you may see why this is such a big deal for me. So 400 years ago, slavery began. 400 years ago was the start of the time that the first Africans were stolen from Africa and forced into slavery. 300 years ago, Africa, and forced to create, or far removed from our home, and forced to create a new world and a new family in Maryland. And 10 years since I've been back to that land, discovered my roots and my home in the heart of Africa, the Pearl of Africa, Somalia. Less than 20% of African Americans can actually trace their roots to slavery itself. Less than a third actually know their ancestors who were enslaved in the United States. We're talking about a span from 1600s to 1800s. Most modern day African Americans cannot actually point out an actual ancestor, with a few differences, a few who are able to trace their linear roots, mostly due to family oral traditions. So to be able to trace your roots actually to Africa, less than 1% of African Americans is actually able to do that. So you guys see why this is such a big deal for me, right? So this is huge. It's not only going to be fascinating information that we're going to discover on this trip back to Africa in this video, but you guys are going to uncover something that remains hidden, and deeply so, and it's very unfortunately so, for African Americans and African American communities. Hopefully by the end of this video, it will encourage some of my African American followers to also start to search into their own genealogy, look into their roots, ask their grandparents, and try to find their way back to their home in Africa. Stay tuned as I break down step by step the steps I've taken in order to rediscover, and then by the time we get through the video, I will tell you, inshallah, where our roots was founded to be. So stay tuned and let's get started. So as you may have remembered from my previous docu-series, and if you have not had a chance to check that out yet, please check that out. I'll leave it somewhere on the screen for you guys. So my genealogy research began actually with genetic DNA testing. And so I did the DNA test, you know, from the mainstream sources such as 23andMe, African Ancestry. After that, when I discovered my maternal DNA results, I was encouraged to go ahead and start looking into. So that brought me into asking my great-grandmother what she could remember. And she gave me the family name Carroll. She also went for records. Now it is a lot more limited, so you may have to actually go and request, and may even have to pay. At this time though, the census records were free. So I went into the census, and I also went to Ancestry.com and put all the information together to try and find a trace back, which I was able to do successfully. That led us to Yellow Harry Hart, also called Yellow Harry Carroll. What I realized from Yellow Harry recently changed the entire trajectory of my research. I had to go back and actually look at the actual Carroll records to see what was on his records concerning his inventory of slaves. That's Charles Carroll of Carrollton, by the way. What I noticed was that on one of the records, Charles Carroll of Carrollton actually named a mother for Yellow Harry. However, the records of her name was very particular. Now, I always knew that Yellow Harry had named his daughter Rachel after his mother Rachel, and his mother's name was Rachel. But her name was not listed with a last name like all of the other mother slaves. Her name was Rachel of Annapolis. Now, I did my research to try to understand if my assumptions could have been correct, that perhaps her not having a last name in fact traced to her being an original slave directly from Africa. And that's exactly what that meant. By Charles Carroll listing her as Rachel of Annapolis, it shows that she came through the Annapolis port, but that she did not have a previous ownership, and that she perhaps was never assigned a name. That shows that she in fact must have came directly from Africa. So I did a little more research after that. Now I had to see Charles Carroll's inventory and history of buying slaves. In order to do that, I actually had to see where he got most of his slaves from. His main slave merchant, trader, was James Carroll. James Carroll was Charles Carroll's cousin, and the one from whom Charles bought nearly all of his early slaves. So I traced that back to try and see which ships did James Carroll actually deal in. Now, if you go to slavevoyages.com, you can actually see a list of ships from specific owners, ship captains, original ship locations, which would be like from London, England, etc., and even a number of times that the ship went to Africa back and number of cargo. Slavevoyages.com, however, does not have names of slaves or like a record of the slaves. It only has a record of the ship. So you have to go somewhere else to get a record of the slaves, which I'm going to get to that part in just a minute. So after looking at slavevoyages.com, I had to narrow down the ships because there were so many, right? So I had to narrow down the ships to the age of Harry. Now, Harry was apparently born estimated around 1749. That means that Rachel, his mother, had to have been there before 1749, and most likely had to have been a young woman around the 1720s or so. The problem with this part is that based off of the ships that were provided, Charles Carroll bought from his cousin James from particular ships, including one I believe was the Elijah, one was the Margaret, and one was the Elizabeth. But they didn't all seem to fit this narrative to me. Each of them either did not come during a time that I would have thought the estimation was correct, or it would be missing, it didn't come through the port of Annapolis, it maybe came through another port, or it was missing certain details. And so because of this, initially I had dismissed my own theory. My auntie later emailed me and she said, well, Halima, did you ever consider that maybe it could actually be the Margaret from several different trips that they've taken? The Margaret actually took several trips to Africa. Initially, I felt, no, that couldn't be possible. Sorry, guys. So yeah, initially I thought, no, that couldn't be possible. For the Margaret traveled between 1615 to 1619, 1620, thereabout. If that was the case, that would mean that Rachel had to have been too old, really, to have had Harry in 1749. That would put her in her 30s, and most slave women were giving birth very early on, between their preteens, teen years, mostly during their teen years, to their early 20s. So I said, okay, that isn't really historically factual. The only way that could really be right is if Harry is not the firstborn. However, I had to go back and look at something. There I came across evidence that of the slaves that actually were bought from the 1619 Margaret. Charles Carroll bought 6 slaves. 2 of them were women, but they were older women, which didn't really fit the narrative. However, his cousin James Carroll bought several slaves, including very young girls and even babies. Why was this important to know? Because I also found evidence that James Carroll didn't only keep all of his slaves all the time. I even was able to find his will, which explained that he had care of his own accounts, as well as a partnership in Charles Carroll's accounts. Charles Carroll and James also exchanged slaves during this time, not only with other slave owners, but also with each other. There was accounts that Charles Carroll, in fact, did send some of his slaves when his plantation grew too big. He sent some of his slaves to his neighbors or his friends. You can even find an account, an article in which Yellow Harry begs, my grandfather ancestor, begs Charles not to actually sell his daughter Flavia because she was too young. James Carroll, in fact, did the same thing, where there was accounts that he gave or sold some of his slaves to some of his business partners, even those who were a bit vicious, as is mentioned in the book, The Suite of Independence, based off of James Carroll, or James Carroll's book, and also including James Carroll's daybook. Within that as well, Charles was in fact indebted to James. So despite having a large amount of wealth, James had even more. He was crazy wealthy. He had an equivalent of billions, hundreds of billions of dollars, able to purchase anything that he wanted, and he lived quite lavishly. He kind of attached that. So while Charles was a tad bit more simple, especially in the public eye as a political figure, James, who wasn't quite so a political figure at the time, could afford to live a lot more lavishly. In this, some of the debt that occurred for Charles was based off of the exchange of slaves and vice versa. Now, this was enough for me to go back and take a look again at the possibility that while Charles only bought 6 slaves, he in fact could have still had some of the slaves, or exchanged some of the female slaves that James had. This is the link that I'm still discovering and still doing a little bit more research about. However, even with this fact aside, it is strong enough for me to be able to point back to the Margaret as the ship that brought our ancestor and sailed from the Bunce Island, where the Margaret typically sailed from, into American Annapolis port. With this information, let's get a little bit more into talking about the Bunce Island. What is the Bunce Island? So the Bunce Island is a popular slave-holding port, almost like Gorée Island. A lot of people know about Gorée Island in Senegal. Bunce Island is also similar, and in fact, it is an unknown slave-holding spot that people can actually visit for tourism if they want to see a little bit more of the slave history of Africans and African Americans. So Bunce Island is in Sierra Leone, and it borders Sierra Leone and Guinea. It is along the port towards this area. It existed and was an active port in this part of Western Africa between the 1600s to the late 1700s, early 1800s. It imported over 100,000 African slaves into the United States. Among these popular slaves, the popular destinations for these slaves was mostly inland Africa. Very few of the slaves, in fact, came from the port or the coastal area of Sierra Leone and Guinea itself. Based off of the records of where many of the slaves were taken from, some of James Carroll's as well as historical records, which I did research on, mentions that for the Bunce Island, many of the slaves were taken inland within Sierra Leone, landwise, within Guinea, landwise, and further north. That points to Mali and Niger, as well as many other countries within that area. Now, why was that important? This was where it all began. When I did my genetic research, as I discussed at the beginning of this video, I actually discovered our traces back to Africa from our genetic popularity, well, our genetic link. However, mainstream DNA is not really enough for you to say, okay, well, this is where I come from. We're going to get into that in another video, inshallah. So what I had to do was actually take my raw data or my DNA results and send it to an anthropologist and a geneticist to actually analyze the data trace by trace, chromosome by chromosome. That made it a lot more accurate and reliable. I was sent back a genetic tracing map. When we look at the map, the green dots on the map locates the old world average, which is the old world genetic tracing or roots. The purple one is the one that appears next in our genetics but was mixed a bit later. The green dot is the most accurate dot or the most accurate tracing of our genetic region. If you guys take a look at this map, you can see that the green dot for my genetic ancestry traced back to northern Niger and northern Mali. And for my auntie, it traced back to northern Mali, to southern Mali, which is the border of Guinea. In addition to the information found on here, we also discovered that slave owners or bidders taking on a slave auction would often give a general label in order to mention or to advertise where slaves came from. This would make the slaves more appealing if people were considering slaves from specific areas. That was important to mention because some of the slave buyers would believe that slaves from certain areas were healthier or more fit for work. Guineas were the label used in the slave auction that took place from the slaves brought by James Carroll. This doesn't mean that the slaves were actually from Guinea, but it means that they were taken or imported, or exported I should say, from that particular area. So they called them guineas. This was important to know as well because this gave a further connection between Guinea and Mali, which did come up as a common connection inland for where many of the slaves were taken. This, in fact, became very important DNA evidence connecting my ancestral DNA and Rachel to actually the Buns Island as James Carroll's stolen slaves. So, with all of this information, what exactly is the link to Africa? Is it Mali? Is it Guinea? Is it Sierra Leone? Alright, you've probably been waiting for this very moment. You're saying, yeah, all the other historical data is just too much for my mind. We want to know, where do you come from in Africa? Here it is. I'm going to explain it to you now. So, to be able to find an exact village that you're from in Africa, or exact clan or tribe that you're from in Africa, is going to be nearly impossible. No one's going to be able to find that anymore. But we will discuss Alex Haley in a separate video. I know according to Alex Haley's Kunta Kinte, it appears that we should be able to find a clan, a tribe that, welcomes us back home. But unfortunately, the real story is far from a romanticized one. For James Carroll's imported slaves, as well as much of the slaves that came in from Africa to the United States, nearly none of them kept their name. Only those few that you have heard of in American history has really been known. Most of the slaves' names were changed as soon as they reached the port. In fact, when they were actually on the ship and coming off the ship, and this part was very brutal to read in the daybook and in the Suite of Independence, but many of them, including the small children, were branded as soon as they got off, and they were listed in a list of a ledger with only the name Negro man, Negro woman, Negro boy, or Negro girl. Their identity was immediately stripped the moment that they reached new soil. There's no way to be able to really trace that history back to an exact point without that name. In addition, not a single slave was mentioned for where they were originally from. No language was mentioned, no land, no kingdom, no tribe. None of that would be mentioned anymore. So with that said, how do I really know where I come from? Several things here. Using the data of where James Carroll got most of his slaves is the one point. The second point is our genetic link and our genetic ancestry. This links back to, as I mentioned, northern Mali and southern Mali as the connection between my ancestry and my aunties. Mali seems to be the central theme here. In order to get more of an idea, I had to actually go back into African history and now take a closer look at what history was like in Mali at this time. So let's go back into the early 1700s. In the early 1700s, Mali was just recovering from the fall of the Mali Empire, which fell within the late 1600s. By the early 1700s, the former Mali Empire was now separated into several different individual states and kingdoms. These states and kingdoms were also led by different specific clans, such as the Tuareg or Tamashek in the north. You had the Fulani or Fulbe, which migrated down into the south and led Futa Jalon. And then you had the Mandinka or Malinke, which controlled the central part of what is now Mali. The Mali Empire was made up of several different countries, stretching from Mali, Niger, Senegal, Mauritania, Burkina Faso, Ivory Coast, and Guinea. That's quite a vast amount of land. However, because of the conflict and continued chaos from the fall of the Mali Empire into the states, much of this land had already been divided, separated. People had started to be dispersed, into small towns, hiding in smaller villages. During this time, Europeans also began to come along the ports and start to go into the mainland area of what was formerly the Mali Empire. With this information, knowing about the current chaos and the chaotic state of these smaller states and towns and villages, they took advantage by stealing many of their slaves where they were most vulnerable. And in fact, this is why many of the slaves that were taken were in fact women or very young. In addition to the political chaos that the region was suffering at the time, the people were also facing vast desertification. The Sahara Desert and the Sahel that you guys see today was nowhere near like what it was in the late 1600s, early 1700s. To get more information about this, I actually had to go into weather records of this region, or the Sahel at the time. The Sahel, which used to see daily rainfall, started to see sparse rainfall of just a couple drops a month to just a couple drops a year. I was able to see the gradual spreading of the desert within these very old geological records. Looking further into these records, I also discovered that many of the clans in the north would have traveled and migrated into the south by the time that the slave Bunce Island, the slave ship the Margaret, had come to Bunce Island or had landed on Bunce Island. Rachel was highly likely to be from among them and perhaps was a young girl at this time. It is likely, based off of the purple dot, the secondary spot on our map, that in fact her family migrated from the northern part of Mali and settled in this southern part of Mali a few years before Rachel was actually taken as a slave. This record was very important because putting together both the weather record, the historical context, as well as the Bunce Islands records and James Carroll's records, it appears that there is a highly likely chance that our roots and origin is definitely associated with the Mali Empire. Based on this convergence of genetic evidence, historical records, and family history, it is highly likely that Rachel would have originated from the region most associated with the Mali Empire, which nowadays covers Mali, Niger, and neighboring Sahel areas. Now, of course, we cannot find the exact country besides the region because during this time, as I said, desertification was not as prevalent as it is now. So the town and dot that's actually traced on my ancestral map is now completely covered by desert. Secondly, these borders did not exist in the 1700s. These borders wouldn't come until much later. And so country Mali, Niger, Mauritania did not actually exist during that time. They were regions, kingdoms, and villages and towns. They were not defined as the modern day borders that we see today, which is another reason why any African American would not be able to trace back to an exact region. These individual border lands were brought about from French and British colonization. Before that, African Americans' ancestors would not have existed within these borders. They would have claimed either a region, a kingdom, a tribe, a village, or a city as their home. Despite that information, genetic analysis shows ancestral components responding or corresponding to Hausa, Fulani, and Mandinka tribes, which are consistent with the Sahel Mali region of Western Africa. Historical records, including the documented activities of James Carroll on the Margaret, indicate that enslaved populations were captured from those exact regions and transported to Bunce Island, aligning with Rachel's capture and possible movements. So despite the kind of inconsistencies and the differences in being able to point out an exact location, or being able to say, yes, I am from Mali, or yes, I am from this particular village, or I am from Timbuktu. Even though we're not able to say that, all of this combined evidence strongly supports Rachel's origins and our family roots being tied to the ethnic and geographical heritage of the former Mali Empire. Even stronger so, our genetic components and chromosomal evidence traces back that our most common ancestor could be linked to what would today be modern-day Mali and Niger. So guys, I have given you a lot of information, and I know that this may all be pounding in your brain right now, but one of your main questions that you must have right now is, well, Halima, how do we know that this information is accurate? That is a valid question. I just mentioned to you that it's not really possible to find an ancestral village or exact link. It would have to be overall a region. So how do I really know that my roots come from the Mali Empire? Now, as I mentioned to you, our genetic components, our chromosome analysis gave us that link. Now, the chromosomal map is actually very accurate. The green dot on the map, so we have two different maps that we are given. One is a cluster of genetic analysis, which points out to our ethnic link or our ethnic connection. That means that that cluster of dots relates us back to Mandinka and Hausa Fulani. That is pretty accurate because they divide your DNA evidence by chromosome and use that to find relatives in these common ethnic backgrounds. We're going to get to this in a separate video where I will explain why this is not always accurate. However, in the cluster map that I was provided, it is accurate because it in fact shows a dissection of DNA evidences. Then we have the map, and once again, as mentioned, the colorization of the map, the green dot, in fact, is a lot more accurate than any other DNA evidences. That green dot shows that the cluster that came up in our chromosomal evidence is directly related to what is discovered in that part of the map or that region of the map. So the DNA chromosomal balance assists us in making sure that our discoveries are accurate, and it is pretty accurate. It is highly accurate. Again, it cannot discover whether you are from Mali or Niger exactly, but it accurately highlights the point that links the most of your chromosomal evidence to that region. However, DNA evidence is not really enough to be able to claim it. So in addition to that, being able to find historical evidences is what actually makes this a lot more accurate. Looking into the Bunce Island history, the Margaret ship's history, James Carroll and Charles Carroll's history, it all links and comes together to exactly to what I've discovered. That means that it is a high chance that this information is pretty accurate because all of it points to the same direct link. The only part that is still missing for me is whether Rachel was indeed a slave formerly of James Carroll's inventory and given later on to Charles Carroll. There is evidence to point that they did exchange their slaves. To get an added touch would just be to find an exact historical record that says this young girl was taken from James Carroll's plantation and given to Charles Carroll. However, the problem with this is that many times their personal lives was not really recorded. Their inventories were recorded for very specific business reasons. That inventory was important whether for as a receipt or as a record of debt or a record of growth. But they wouldn't have really just recorded the daily lives or their personal lives in connection to any of their slaves. Which is why we would also not really know, unfortunately, if Charles Carroll were intimate, forcefully so, obviously, with Rachel, my ancestor, when she reached America, when she reached Annapolis, or later on, or those details. Their bedroom routines would not have been written down as well, especially for Charles Carroll, who was a public politician and had to maintain a certain perspective. The way that we know that he obviously was with her is through Yellow Harry, whose ancestry, despite it being disputed by some historians, it is very much so clear that Yellow Harry was a produce of such an environment and relationship. So the exact exchange, if it was a friendly exchange, it was just without money, of whether a child was taken from James' plantation and sent to Charles, would not have been written down. They wouldn't have seen that as important enough to write down. It's almost as though I loaned my cousin a pen and my cousin kept the pen. That's how it was. But at the time, slaves were only seen as property, and their humanity was not really notified, identified, or recognized. So these kind of details that James might have found to be minor would not have been important enough to write down. Also, as mentioned, their entire identities were completely changed. So we have an identity of Rachel by the time she reached the Doregan Manor or the plantation, and when she was on a ship, but not the in-between. However, still without that one link, we still have found a mountain of information that still connects us to all of the information that I have outlined above or before. Even without finding that one single link, we still have a very valid connection to Charles Carroll, to Bunce Island, to Africa. We do know that our line and the possibilities of our genetic line, of what we discovered genetically, links to the kind of slaves that Charles Carroll did and James Carroll did in fact take. So again, with these historical records, these old receipts, transcripts, dialogues, evidences, along with the chromosomal evidence, gives me a clear picture of the outcome that I have drawn out. That means that it appears to be very highly accurate information. And that is how I am able to ensure the accuracy of my lineage and the information tracing us back to Africa. It has been a very emotional, exhausting, and yet very rewarding journey. I could not be more excited than I am right now to be able to actually find a place in Africa, whether a country or just a region, that I can say was once my ancestors' home. I have always felt a connection to Africa from the moment I landed into Ethiopia to the 10 years I have been here ever since. Even before that time, it is no surprise that my ancestry would link back to Mali, considering that every time that I would hear anything from Mali, or even just feel the silk of the clothes, I felt that this was somehow very familiar, very emotional, and very much so like a spirit or an artifact of home. So being able to be here and share this genetic research and this genealogy with you is not only just a matter of me trying to get views and share some interesting information, but me sharing a piece of my hidden self with the world. It is me officially coming out and claiming Africa for the home I always knew it was. Even though I haven't found a specific country, I still believe that I have found the soil beneath my feet to be home itself. Mali and the former Mali Empire was once my ancestors' home, and now living here in Somalia, I know that the water of Africa, the air of Africa, the air that I'm breathing, the fruit that we're tasting, is all possibly a familiarity to my ancestor 300 years ago. It really means a lot for me to share this, and I am so happy to be able to embark on this journey and to be able to have you guys embark on this journey with me. If you have any questions about any of my genetic research or how you can start your own, please make sure to comment in the comment section below, or you can email me. I will leave my email address in the information, the bio section, so that you guys can contact me. And you can also contact me on all of my social media platforms for more information. Now, this series is actually going to be the first start of a new project I'm starting, which is the Sultana Teaches series, where I will be giving you guys some informative videos about once a week and sharing more of this piece of my journey, as well as other helpful learning information, tips, and knowledge with my fellow followers, my beloveds, my fellow Sultanas. So please stay tuned with me. Make sure that you follow, make sure that you like this video, and of course subscribe. Click on the bell notification button so that you can be notified whenever I post, especially so you can stay up to date on the Sultana Teaches videos. And again, if you want any further information about any of the links that I came up with, feel free to reach out to me, and I am more than happy to share this with you. This isn't just a moment for me to bring out my history, but for a community to come together and rediscover our ancestors. And so here, welcome my beloveds to my series, my history, back to the roots, rediscovering my roots in Mali. Thank you so much for joining me for this video. I hope you enjoyed it. Please let me know your thoughts in the comments below, and I can't wait to see you in the next one. Have a great day, guys. Assalamu alaikum and bye.